Hey friends, welcome. Tonight, we are stepping into a world where silence was not peace, it was survival. A world where people slept not in comfort, but in exhaustion, and woke not with choice, but with duty. This is the servant's night. And for the next while, we are not just talking about it, we are walking in it. So before we begin, take a moment to like this video and subscribe if these slow, quiet histories help you rest. Let me know in the comments what time it is for you, and where in the world you are listening from. It is always deeply moving to see how many of us are falling asleep under the same stars. Now dim the lights. Maybe wrap yourself in something warm. Let the noise of the day drop away. And come with me, into a world of stone, shadow, and quiet endurance. A world where people served without thanks, slept without dreams, and woke each morning, simply to survive again. Let's begin. The mist clung low to the morning fields, curling like breath around the hooves of the oxen tethered at the edge of the estate. A crow called in the distance, its voice sharp in the stillness, as if protesting the hush that blanketed the world. The village behind him was fading into gray, its low roofs and thatched cottages dissolving in the fog. Ahead, stone walls rose like a fortress of silence, ivy trailing across their surface like old scars. And there, halfway open as if daring him to enter or run, stood the manor gate, iron, cold, and watching. The boy paused. He had no name anymore, not one that mattered. His mother had whispered it to him through her tears when she kissed his forehead goodbye, her hands rough and trembling, pressing a cloth-wrapped bundle into his arms. The bundle had held a patched shirt, a crust of bread, and the wooden cross his sister carved from a tree branch before the fever took her. He still felt the weight of her loss like a stone tied to his chest. But there was no time to grieve. The bailiff had waited. The gate had creaked open. He stepped forward. The manor's courtyard was colder than he expected. The stone beneath his feet was still damp with dew, and the air held the sting of the forge though he could not yet see it. Servants moved like ghosts around the perimeter, thin shapes in woolen garments too large or too small, eyes downcast, shoulders curled inward. No one looked at him. Not even the steward who had met him at the gate, glanced once at his hands, and motioned silently for him to follow. They passed under an archway. It swallowed sound. On one side, the chapel bell stood silent and still, coated with soot. On the other, the kitchens breathed steam and noise through a side window, but he was not allowed to look. The steward walked briskly, his boots making no sound on the flagstones. The boy's own feet, bare beneath frayed wrappings, slapped softly with every step. Inside, the manor's servants' wings smelled of boiled vegetables and old straw. A narrow corridor opened to a low-ceilinged room lit only by a single oil lamp. Two older boys sat sharpening knives at a bench. A girl stood bent over a washtub, her hair limp with steam. No one paused their task when the steward entered. "This one's for inside work," the steward said flatly, his first and only words. "He's small. Quiet." A woman turned from the hearth, apron damp, face lined with fatigue, and nodded once. "We will see what he's made of." He was told to undress. His clothes were taken, his bundle too. The shirt, the cross, the crust of bread, gone. A smock was thrown at him in return, coarse and too tight at the neck. It smelled of mildew and ash. No one asked his name. That night, he lay on a bed of straw in a corner of the servants' dormitory. He had not eaten since the day before. His stomach curled in on itself, groaning quietly into the dark. He did not cry. No one cried here, he already understood that. Beside him, someone coughed in their sleep, a sharp sound, then silence. He stared at the ceiling, where spiders crept between beams. The cold crept in through the cracks in the stone. He remembered his sister's hands. The way she had traced shapes in the dirt while he watched. She would have loved the carved beams, the tall ceilings. She had always wanted to see the inside of a great house. And now he was here. The thought did not bring comfort. It only made the emptiness worse. In the hallway, a bell rang once, sharp, metallic, final. Somewhere in the distance, the iron gate closed. He had stepped into a world where silence was safety, obedience was survival, and nothing, not even his own name, belonged to him anymore. The house was his whole world now, and he was its lowest ghost. A shadow in the margins of other people's lives. He woke before the sun the next morning. Not because he was called, but because his body knew better than to oversleep. The others were already dressing, silently, methodically, pulling on coarse linen tunics and wrapping feet in cloth. No one spoke. One boy glanced at him and looked away again. The air was cold enough to make his breath visible. They moved like shadows, as if afraid to disturb the silence. The steward returned before dawn had even crept over the eastern wall. He carried a short rod and tapped the stones once. That was all it took. The room emptied in less than 30 seconds. The new boy followed, his legs stiff from sleeping on straw, his eyes raw with exhaustion. The line of servants filed out into the gray courtyard. Mist still hugged the earth. Somewhere a dog barked. Somewhere a rooster crowed. But here, within the stone walls, there was only the sound of shuffling feet. Their work had already begun. He was taken to the kitchen first. Not to eat, but to observe. The cook was already bellowing instructions, sweat on her brow despite the cold. She pointed him toward the ashes under the hearth and handed him a bucket. Sift it. Then scrub it. And if you spill it, you lick it off the stones. No one laughed. Not even her. He worked in silence, his hands quickly blackened by soot. The ashes were warm, then hot, then suddenly painful. But he did not stop. A girl passed him with a bowl of potato peels, her arm trembling. She did not meet his eyes. They were all fragments of some larger machine, grinding quietly toward a goal he could not yet understand. Hours passed. He fetched water from the well, hauled wood to the upper chamber, scrubbed pots until his fingers cracked. When he faltered, a boy his age kicked his foot sharply. Faster, the boy hissed. You fall behind, we all get less. The message was clear. There was no room for weakness. Mistakes were not punished privately. They were punished collectively, and the others made sure you never forgot it. At midday, he was given a heel of bread. He ate it kneeling in the hallway, back straight, eyes forward. No crumbs were to be left. Not a drop of water wasted. Hunger was not a problem to solve. It was a fact of life. By evening, his muscles ached in places he had never noticed. His throat was sore from disuse. His hands stung. But more than the pain was the weight, the understanding that tomorrow would be the same, and the day after, and the one after that. There was no end. Only the repetition of duty, of silence, of eyes that never looked up. He lay down again on straw that was colder than before. The air was still. The dormitory was quiet. And just before his eyes closed, he thought again of the iron gate. It had not just closed behind him. It had closed over him. Before the birds even stirred in the hedgerows or the kitchen fire roared to life, the boy was awake. Not because he had slept well, but because his body had learned already, in less than a week, that sleep was not a sanctuary. Sleep in the manor was shallow, cold, and haunted by footsteps in the corridor or the groaning of old beams. Sleep was never safe. So when the first hint of blue brushed the black sky outside, his eyes were already open, his ears tuned to every creak of wood and muffled cough in the dormitory. There were no clocks, only the rhythm of habit and survival. Beside him, a lanky boy stirred under a frayed blanket. On the other side, a girl no older than 8 rolled onto her side and curled tighter into herself, her arms wrapped around nothing. No one spoke. No one ever did at this hour. Words belonged to the masters, and morning was a time of silence. He pulled on his smock, the same coarse garment he had worn for 3 days, and wrapped his feet in thin strips of cloth. They were still damp from the day before. He winced as he stood. Every muscle protested, and his knees buckled briefly before he forced them straight. The floor was freezing. His breath fogged the air. But the steward's bell had not yet rung, and he knew from watching the others that it was better to be waiting than to be called. The hallway outside the dormitory smelled of dust and soot. The narrow corridor that led to the servants' quarters was dim, lit only by a few slivers of moonlight sneaking through cracks in the shuttered windows. Shadows moved ahead of him, older boys heading toward the water pumps, 2 girls carrying buckets already. Their faces were grim, their eyes hollow. The manor was like a living thing at this hour, breathing but not awake. Doors groaned on their hinges, mice skittered along the baseboards, and the faint crackle of cooling embers whispered from the kitchen hearth. The grand hall above remained dark, its tapestries hanging heavy with sleep. But in the underbelly of the house, the day had already begun. His first task was to fetch water. The outer courtyard was a silent grave of frost, the cobblestones slick and sharp beneath his feet. The well stood in the corner near the animal pens, its wooden frame slick with dew. He heaved the bucket down into the dark, felt the rope go taut, then drew it up again. His arms shook. Water sloshed cold onto his wrists. Another boy stepped in to take the next turn without a word. By the time the bell rang, sharp and final, like the stroke of judgment, he had already been working for nearly an hour. They filed back into the kitchens to begin their proper duties. Fires had to be built in 5 hearths. Pots from the previous day needed scouring. Grain was to be ground by hand with a stone mill. The cook barked orders like thunder rolling across a valley, and the oldest servants moved like dancers, precise and wordless. The boy was given ashes again. His job was to clean out the hearth and reset it for the cook's morning fire. He reached in with a flat-handled shovel, his fingers trembling, skin cracking from the cold. He coughed when the soot rose into his face, but did not stop. There was no time to cough, no space to recover. Beside him, another servant, a girl with braided hair and tired eyes, whispered, "Use your sleeve to cover your nose." Her kindness startled him. He nodded. She said nothing more. After the fire was lit, and the morning stew set to boil, they were sent to the laundry hall. Baskets of linen waited like corpses, heavy, cold, and tangled. The water in the washing troughs was icy enough to burn. The boy dunked his hands into the first basin and gasped. He was told to scrub until his knuckles bled, and he did. Mid-morning came and went without food. Hunger had already dulled the edge of his thoughts. He barely noticed the ache in his stomach anymore. It had become a companion. The ache was familiar, almost comforting, like an old wound that reminded him he was still alive. His next task was to sweep the stairway that led from the Lord's chamber down to the chapel. Each step had to be wiped by hand, and any dust left behind would be noticed. The stairs were steep and cold, and the stone bit at his knees as he knelt to polish them. A passing noblewoman nearly stepped on his hand. She did not look down. By noon, his fingers were stiff and raw. His shoulders screamed from scrubbing, and his lower back throbbed with fatigue. But he was learning. He was beginning to understand how to move without being seen, how to anticipate a command before it was spoken. He was learning to disappear into the walls. When the bell rang again, 2 short strikes this time, they were permitted a few minutes to eat. A crust of bread, no thicker than his palm, and a wooden cup of thin broth. He ate kneeling. No one dared speak. The afternoon passed in a blur of more washing, more fetching, more lifting, and sweeping, and avoiding the steward's eye. A boy was slapped for dropping a ladle. A girl was dragged by her ear for speaking too loudly. The boy kept his head down. When the sun finally began to slip behind the manor walls, they were sent to the tools shed to clean and oil the iron. He did not even know what half the tools were for. He only knew that they had to shine. He rubbed the dull edge of a carving knife until his thumb bled, then hid the cut in his smock. That night, back in the dormitory, the sun had not yet broken the horizon when the boy stood in the lower hallway, waiting for the day's first command. A cold wind slipped through the cracks in the stone wall, brushing against his skin like a whisper of disapproval. Around him, the others moved with silent efficiency, pulling boots onto frozen feet, wrapping linen shawls over their shoulders. There was no conversation, only motion. Work began not with a command, but with movement. One girl headed for the stables. A boy lifted a basket of ash from the hearth. Another carried a basin toward the laundry. The boy had no assigned post yet. He was still new enough to be everyone's responsibility, and therefore, everyone's tool. The cook summoned him with a gesture. Her hand, red from heat and scrubbing, pointed to the basin of vegetables by the hearth. Peel. Quickly. He knelt beside it, reaching for a root so cold it burned his fingertips. His nails were already torn from the previous day's scrubbing. He peeled in silence. The skin of the vegetable curled like old parchment under his blade. Midway through the pile, he was sent away. Another task had called him, gathering kindling from the woodpile outside the north wall. The path was slick with mud from last night's rain. His feet slipped twice, but he caught himself each time. His arms filled with wet sticks that smelled of mold and rot. He brought them to the laundry fire, then returned again. And again. And again. By mid-morning, he had moved water, stones, baskets, and pots. He had swept the great hall's corners where soot collected like secrets. He had folded linen that was not dry, arranged apples on a pewter plate, and polished a boot that was not his. None of the tasks were large. But none of them ended. The manor did not slow. Its pulse beat through labor. The noble family dined at set times, and each meal meant dozens of small duties for the invisible hands that prepared it, carrying jugs, arranging cloth, setting logs in precise patterns in the hearth. Every item in its place. Every face unseen. Mistakes were punished differently depending on who witnessed them. A dropped tray earned a slap if seen by the steward, a public scolding if seen by a noble, and a shared punishment if it delayed a master's comfort. Once, he spilled a cup of cider while adjusting a platter. The cup cracked on the stone floor. He dropped to his knees to gather the shards, but it was too late. 3 other boys were sent without bread that night because of him. He learned quickly to hold his breath when carrying anything. He learned to take smaller steps. He learned to apologize with his eyes, even before blame was placed. The rhythm of service was not just about motion, it was about intuition. To anticipate a command was to survive. The girl with braided hair, the same who had once warned him to cover his nose from soot, passed him in the corridor carrying a heavy brass pot. Her eyes met his only for a moment. There was no warmth, only acknowledgement, a shared understanding of the grind. Lunch, if it came, was never more than a few minutes. He was allowed to kneel beside the stable wall and eat half a crust of barley bread. It had been soaked in broth, turning it to paste. A boy across from him had lost a tooth 2 days prior, and now sucked his bread slowly, one eye swollen from infection. The boy swallowed his food without chewing. There was no time. The bell rang again, and they were back in motion. He was sent to the south field to help a gardener pull weeds from the manor's herb beds. The ground was still wet. His knees soaked through within minutes. The old man beside him said nothing for over an hour. Then, finally, he muttered, "If you find nettle, keep it. The ladies' tinctures call for it." The boy nodded. His fingers were numb. He plucked weeds with trembling hands, dirt caked beneath his nails, the scent of mint and mud filling his lungs. Time passed without measure. When the gardener stood and walked away, he followed. No command needed. Back in the house, he passed the great mirror in the entryway. Servants were not allowed to look into it, but he glanced once, quickly. What he saw was not himself, just a pale, dirt-streaked shadow in a too large smock, eyes sunken, hair matted to his forehead. A ghost boy. Evening came slowly. It dragged like the final bell of a church after a funeral. The sky dimmed, and the shadows grew taller in the manor's long halls. But the work did not stop. Pots to clean. Floors to scrub. Tables to reset for the next day. By now, his hands were blistered in 3 places. He had not noticed when they burst. The older boy who slept near him in the dormitory passed him in the corridor. He said flatly, "You will never catch up. But you can fall slower." It was not encouragement. It was truth. When the bell finally rang to mark the end of labor, he stood still for a moment, afraid to relax. The silence was louder than the bell had been. He walked slowly to the dormitory, legs stiff, eyes half closed. That night, as he lay down, he tried to remember a time when he had done nothing. A morning where his hands were idle. A moment when he moved because he wanted to, not because he was ordered. But no memory surfaced. Either it had been too long ago, or the memory itself had been scrubbed away like soot from a noble's floor. The manor demanded everything, even the idea of rest. And so he slept, not to recover, but simply to survive the next cycle, the next endless, unyielding day of work that never ends. The master of the house was rarely seen, and when he was, he passed like a storm cloud, noticed only by the chill he left in his wake. The boy learned early that you did not look directly at the lord of the manor. His gaze was not for you. His voice was not meant to be heard by your ears. His presence was not a space to be shared, but to be cleared. swiftly, silently. It began with footsteps. Not the heavy boots of the steward or the soft pads of the cook's shoes, but deliberate, calculated strides that echoed down the great hall. They were always a few beats too slow, too composed, like the steps of someone who knew the earth owed them room. The boy had once stood at the wrong place when those steps approached. He had frozen, not out of defiance but confusion, his arms full of turnips, his mind still fogged with hunger and fatigue. By the time he realized, it was too late. The master's cloak had brushed his shoulder as he passed, and the steward's hand was on his neck a moment later, dragging him backward like a sack of meal. He had been slapped, not by the master, but by the system itself, through the steward, through silence, through the invisible law that governed the household. The message was clear: you did not enter the same air the master breathed. From then on, he watched the corridors with animal alertness. The master's schedule became a code to decipher. He ate at the second bell after dawn. He walked the north garden before the midday meal. He held court in the solar on Wednesdays. And always, he moved without announcing himself. It was the servant's duty to vanish before he appeared. There was another law too, more subtle, more cruel. If the master addressed you, you were to kneel. Not bow, not nod. Kneel. Immediately. Even if your hands were full. Even if you were in the middle of carrying hot coals. You were to lower yourself until your head was level with his boots. The boy witnessed it once. An older servant had failed to kneel quickly enough. The master's cane, an ornamental thing of polished wood and silver, had struck his thigh. No word spoken. No apology given. The servant limped for 2 weeks. The lady of the house was no gentler. She did not strike. She did not shout. But her gaze alone could unmake a person. It roamed across the faces of the servants like a torch flame, looking not for signs of life but for flaws, irregularities, crooked hems or unwashed ears. She spoke rarely, but when she did, her words were cold knives, clean, precise, and cutting to the bone. The boy's job often took him past her chambers. He moved quickly there. The air near her door was perfumed with lavender and fear. Once, while refilling the basin, he caught his reflection in the silver mirror on her wall. He did not recognize himself. For a moment, he saw not a boy, but a smudge, a stain that marred her perfect world. The noble children were more dangerous still. They were young, but they had learned cruelty as language. The lord's eldest son once told him to bark like a dog while he threw crumbs at the ground. The boy hesitated, only for a moment, and the child screamed for the steward. He barked. He barked until his throat hurt, until the other servants turned away, until even the cook refused to meet his eyes. When it was over, he sat in the dark pantry, shaking with humiliation and cold. But no one spoke of it again. Because the master's gaze did not need to be present to enforce itself. It lingered in the silence, in the walls, in the way everyone held their breath. There was an understanding among the servants. You were not seen. You did not exist. But you were watched. One girl, older than the rest, once whispered to him, "The Lord doesn't care about us. He doesn't even see us. But if you're noticed, even once, you'll regret it." To be ignored was to be safe. To be invisible was to survive. Still, the master's gaze had a weight. When he entered a room, even unannounced, it bent the air. You could feel it, a tension behind your spine, a sudden pressure in your chest, like a hawk circling just out of sight. The boy learned to sense it without turning his head. He would lower his eyes, tuck his chin, still his breath, and become a statue. On rare occasions, the master spoke aloud in the presence of servants. His voice was smooth, bored, detached. He might comment on the weather, or the grain deliveries, or the new tapestries. But even these words were not for them. They were for the steward, or the priest, or the lady. The boy once heard him say, "These stones have held more loyalty than most men." He wondered if the master knew that servants listened, even when they should not. That every whispered insult, every passing cruelty, every glance was a stone added to the burden each of them carried. The master never cleaned his own boots, never dressed himself, never poured his own wine. But he did not thank those who did. Gratitude was not a currency spent on shadows. Once, during a winter storm, The boy saw the master watching the snow fall from the great window. His cloak was lined with fur. A fire crackled beside him. Outside, a servant slipped in the ice while crossing the courtyard with a bundle of firewood. The boy heard the thud of the fall. The master turned his head slightly, not toward the sound, but toward the fire. He said nothing. And in that silence, the boy understood the truth. The master's gaze was not just cruel. It was indifferent. He had built a world where eyes only saw downward. Where those who served were less than furniture. Where a slip, a mistake, a glance could end a life. And so the boy walked with his shoulders drawn in, his eyes always lowered, his shadow always tucked behind the light. Because in the manor, survival was not about pleasing the master. It was about avoiding his gaze entirely. To be seen was to suffer. And the worst fate of all was to be remembered. Hunger was not a moment in the day. It was the day. It threaded itself into every breath, every task, every movement. It was a dull ache in the belly, sometimes sharp but mostly low and constant, a kind of emptiness that no longer shocked, only lingered. For the boy, it began when he woke and lasted until sleep took him, and even then, it sometimes haunted his dreams. He had not tasted meat since the day he arrived at the manor. The scent of roasted bird or beef would drift through the corridors and taunt the servants like a cruel jest. The boy had learned not to react. Those smells were not for him. They belonged to the masters and their guests, to the great table in the high hall where golden plates shone and silver knives scraped bone. He, like the others, ate on the floor. There was no dining room for servants, no table, no cloth, no plates. There was a corner near the hearth. Or, if one was unlucky, a patch of stone near the stables. Meals were not served. They were distributed, like feed for animals, in portions so small they barely covered the palm. Breakfast, if given, was a piece of cold bread. Not fresh. Never warm. Often stale, with edges hard enough to cut the inside of a cheek. Sometimes it came with a smear of lard. More often, it came with nothing. A boy once whispered that chewing slowly helped trick the body into thinking it had more. Another girl said she drank water before eating, to feel fuller. Tricks. That was all they had. The boy watched others closely to learn how they survived the hunger. One servant, a silent older woman who worked in the laundry, always pressed her crust against the stone wall before eating, to soften it with damp. A kitchen boy hid scraps under his shirt, and snuck them to a younger girl too weak to stand. These small kindnesses happened rarely, and always in secret. But hunger turned even the kindest hearts cruel. One day, the boy was sent to the refuse pile behind the kitchens. He had to carry out vegetable peels, egg shells, and bones stripped of meat. As he dumped the bucket, a sliver of beet fell onto the dirt. His fingers moved before his mind could stop them. He snatched it up, brushed it once, and brought it to his lips. A sharp whistle. He froze. The cook's assistant had seen. A boy no older than 15 but already bitter with authority. He strode forward, knocked the beet from his hand, and slapped him hard across the ear. "Stealing from the master's scraps?" he hissed. "Maybe next time you eat with the pigs." He did not cry. He simply picked up the empty bucket and walked back inside, ears ringing, stomach burning. Lunch was no better. A cup of thin broth, mostly water with hints of cabbage and salt. It came with half a heel of rye. He dipped the bread in the broth to soften it and swallowed quickly. If he ate too slow, someone might snatch it. That had happened before. The nobles feasted. Trays of pastries, roasted quail, honeyed fruits, wine. The boy glimpsed these marvels as he passed through the great hall, carrying wet cloths or empty goblets. Once, a fig rolled off the table and landed near his foot. No one noticed. He stared at it for several seconds, a jewel of a thing, plump and sweet. But he did not move. He was afraid the act of picking it up would be seen as theft. Better to leave it. Better to starve than be punished for a single taste. Dinner, for servants, came after darkness. If the lord and lady had guests, the meal was skipped entirely. No one asked why. No one complained. Hunger was expected. To serve meant to endure. To endure meant to be empty. The cook once told them, "A full belly makes a lazy hand." The boy hated her for that. But he also knew she ate better than most. Her hands were thick, her cheeks red. She snuck bites as she cooked. He saw her once, licking her fingers after cutting a wedge of cheese. His stomach tightened. He dreamed of food often, thick stews, warm bread, apples, even milk. In one dream, he was back in his mother's house, eating boiled barley with honey. In another, he wandered a field where bread grew on trees. He would wake with his mouth open, the taste of air bitter on his tongue. By the third month, hunger had changed him. He moved slower, but more carefully. He could not waste energy. His ribs showed through the smock. His cheeks were hollow. But his eyes, though tired, still searched for crumbs, for kindness, for anything edible. He learned where the mice nested. He saw them gnawing crumbs under the pantry shelves. Once he caught one. He held it in his hands for a long time. But he could not bring himself to kill it. He let it go. A girl died from eating moldy rye. It had been thrown out, but she retrieved it. Her belly swelled. She vomited black and never woke again. No one spoke her name afterward. She had stolen. She had eaten. She had died. The boy's hunger never left. But he learned to wear it like a cloak. It made him sharp. Made him quiet. Made him survive. And so, between duties, in the folds of each task, in the spaces between commands, he held his hunger like a prayer. A reminder of who he was, and who he must never become. Because in the manor, hunger was not just the absence of food. It was the presence of power. And the only thing lower than a starving servant was a starving servant who dared to feed himself. Obedience in the manor was not taught. It was expected. The air you breathed, the dust you walked on, the invisible hand that guided and corrected without mercy. It did not arrive in commands or lessons. It lived in the bones. It was learned before speech, before thought, through repetition, through pain, through watching others suffer. The boy did not remember the moment he became obedient. It happened gradually, like shadows lengthening at dusk. First, he stopped speaking. Then, he stopped asking questions. Soon, he stopped thinking altogether, at least about himself. His thoughts turned outward, to tasks, to tone, to timing. When to step forward. When to vanish. When to nod, bow, kneel. At first, obedience had frightened him. The depth of it. The silence it required. The way it lived behind the eyes of older servants who moved with mechanical grace. They had no hesitation. They did not flinch. They obeyed before orders were even spoken. He used to think it was practice. Later, he understood it was fear. Fear was the teacher. Obedience, its lesson. The steward never raised his voice. He did not need to. He had a glance sharp as a lash. One look and a boy would drop his eyes and quicken his pace. One look and a girl would stop crying mid-tear. The steward's silence was punishment enough. His approval, if ever granted, was a quiet nod that carried the weight of survival. To disobey, even slightly, was to be seen. And to be seen was to invite consequence. There were levels of disobedience, and therefore levels of punishment. Speaking out of turn earned extra work. Pausing too long before following a command brought a slap. Refusing, questioning, forgetting, those brought harsher things. He remembered the story of a boy who once refused to kneel. No one said what happened to him. Only that his bed had been empty the next morning, his blanket folded neatly, his wooden bowl left untouched. The boy, like the others, did not want to disappear. So he knelt. And each time he did, it became easier. He began to anticipate the steward's footsteps. He knew their rhythm, the way they clicked on stone, the way they softened on rush mats. He could sense when the steward entered a room without seeing him. His back would straighten. His head would lower. Instinct. Reflex. Self-preservation. Obedience followed him into every space. When he walked through the kitchen, he moved along the wall. When he entered a chamber, he paused before the threshold. When spoken to, he answered with, "Yes, sir," or "Yes, mistress." Never more. Never less. Words were dangerous. Silence was safer. Even his body began to obey. It no longer complained. The aching knees, the sore shoulders, the cracked fingers, they became background noise. He moved despite them. Worked through them. Rested only when allowed, He had become a vessel, not for thought, but for commands. Tasks poured into him, and he carried them out. Scrub this. Carry that. Fetch. Kneel. Leave. Return. He absorbed these without resistance. Not because he wanted to, but because resistance had been carved out of him like rot from a board. There was a moment, late one evening, when he stood in the servants' corridor waiting for orders. The steward had paused to speak to the cook. The boy stood still, arms at his sides, eyes lowered. He waited 5 minutes. 10. 15. No one told him to move. So he did not. When the steward finally turned, he looked at the boy and said, "Still here?" The boy nodded. "You did not dismiss me." The steward blinked. Then nodded. Good. It was the first word of praise he had ever received. That night, he lay awake staring at the ceiling beams. Not out of pride, but confusion. He had followed the rule. He had obeyed completely. And he had been noticed, but in a way that did not hurt. Was that what it meant to succeed? Was that what he had been taught to crave? He thought of his name, the one he no longer used. The way his mother had said it when she stroked his hair. He whispered it once into the straw pillow. It sounded foreign, thin, like a word from a different life. The boy who had once asked questions, who had once laughed at frogs by the river bank, was gone. In his place was someone quieter, smaller, less human. But he was alive. And in the manor, obedience meant life. He told himself that, again and again. As he worked. As he scrubbed. As he knelt. Each task became a prayer. Each command a scripture. And when he was not given orders, he still followed the ones from the day before. He carried them forward like coals, keeping them warm in the hollow of his chest. Obedience was no longer a choice. It was who he was. Because in the manor, the only freedom left was how quickly you surrendered your will. And the boy had learned to surrender completely. In the manor, laughter was not forbidden by rule. It was forbidden by atmosphere, by the silence in the halls, by the bowed heads, by the echo of footsteps on stone that warned of someone important approaching. Laughter was not banned outright. It simply had no place. It did not survive in corners where shadows clung and cold water dripped from cracked ceilings. The boy could not remember the last time he had truly laughed. Not a breathy chuckle, not a polite smile, but laughter that rose up from the belly, that crinkled the eyes and made the body forget everything else. He remembered it as something from another life, like sunlight on a river. You could remember the warmth of it, even if you had not felt it in a long time. The other servants carried the same silence. Children with bright eyes were dulled within weeks. Jokes passed in whispers. Smiles were quick and hidden. Once, in the laundry room, a girl had slipped on soap and landed on her back with a loud thud. For half a second, a giggle escaped another boy's lips, unplanned, spontaneous, pure. The steward had appeared in the doorway like a ghost summoned by sound. No word was spoken. The giggling boy was sent to scrub the latrines with his bare hands. After that, no one laughed in the laundry room again. Laughter was risk. Laughter was disobedience in disguise. It meant your mind was not fully in your task, that your spirit had not been fully broken. It was seen as arrogance, a servant daring to feel joy in a world where joy was not theirs to have. Even during festivals, when the manor held feasts and the nobles drank wine until their words slurred, the servants did not laugh. They watched the lords and ladies toss fruit and jest loudly, but their own lips remained sealed. A smirk might be seen as mockery. A grin might be mistaken for insolence. Better to be blank, dull, quiet. The boy once saw two younger servants play a silent game with pebbles behind the stables. They took turns tossing stones into a crack in the wall, each trying to make it bounce twice before disappearing. Their eyes lit up with quiet joy. When one of them succeeded, she clapped her hands without sound, mouthing a cheer. The boy watched from a distance, his chest aching. He did not join them. He could not. Not because he did not want to, but because he was afraid. Afraid of what laughter might cost. That fear lived in everyone. It was the fear of being noticed for the wrong reason. The fear of pleasure being seen as rebellion. The fear that a single moment of levity would undo weeks of obedience. There were rare nights when things softened. After a day of harsh labor, When the weather was not too cold and the steward was absent, a few older boys might whisper jokes in the dormitory. They never laughed aloud. They grinned into their blankets. The boy listened, trying to smile without showing teeth. Even then, one ear always tuned for approaching footsteps. He remembered once trying to make a younger girl laugh. She had been crying after being scolded by the cook, and he had mimicked the cook's waddling walk, exaggerating her voice. For a second, the girl's face lit up. Her smile had been like fire in winter, bright, rare, fleeting. But another servant had seen. The boy was sent to stand outside barefoot in the rain for an hour. When he returned, soaked and shaking, the girl would not meet his eyes. She never smiled at him again. So he learned. Laughter was not worth it. Joy was a debt that always came due. And in the manor, the currency of punishment was high. Still, he missed it. Missed the way it had once made him feel lighter, like the world could be a place of softness. Missed the sound of his sister's laugh when they played in the fields. Missed his own laugh, whatever it had once sounded like. Sometimes, as he drifted to sleep, he imagined a world where laughter was not dangerous. Where servants could speak freely. Where a boy could tell a joke and not be beaten for it. Where smiles were not secrets. But then the bell would ring in his dreams, sharp and cold. And the world would return. Because in the manor, laughter was not forbidden. It was forgotten. And that forgetting, quiet, slow, complete, was worse than any rule ever written. The first time he was assigned to the noble child, he had not expected to feel anything. Not fear. Not wonder. Not even curiosity. He had expected it to be just another duty, another set of silent steps, another pair of eyes not to meet, another day of obedience stitched together with quiet endurance. But he was wrong. The noble child was only a year or two older than him, but already the gap between them felt vast. The boy, the servant, had knelt in ash, scrubbed floors, bled through wool. The noble child had grown in silk, dined on apples, and worn shoes his size since birth. And yet, as he stood in the doorway of the child's chamber, the noble boy looked at him with an expression that was not unkind, but something colder, harder to name. It was the gaze of someone who had never been hungry. "You'll follow me now," the noble boy had said, his voice calm, soft, yet heavy with the weight of knowing he would always be obeyed. "And don't speak unless I ask." He nodded. "Yes, my lord." That was the beginning. Each morning, he would rise before dawn, dress quickly, and report to the chamber of the noble child. He would stand at the side of the wash basin, warming water with trembling hands, preparing the towels, brushing lint from the boy's cloak. He would help with boots, with belts, with the arranging of curls around the shoulders. All of it done in silence. All of it done as though he were invisible. The noble child was not cruel in the way others were. He did not strike. He did not shout. But his words had edges. "You missed a spot. Your hands are filthy. Do not breathe so loudly." Each phrase was a cut, small but sharp, delivered with the casual disdain of someone who had never been corrected. He followed the child through lessons with the tutor, through long walks in the garden, through hours of play in the manor courtyard. Sometimes, the noble boy would speak to him. Ask questions. "Have you ever had a gooseberry tart? What is it like to sleep on straw? Did your father smell of mud?" He never knew how to answer. Any response risked insult. Silence was safer. But even silence could offend. Once, when he did not answer quickly enough, the noble child frowned and said, "You are dull. No wonder you were born to serve." And yet, the boy found himself watching the noble child with strange fascination. There was envy, yes, sharp and sudden when he saw the boy peel a golden apple with a silver knife, or laugh without fear. But there was also something else, something quieter. A sorrow, maybe? Or confusion. Because the noble child, despite everything, was not free. He was watched constantly. He was corrected by adults in soft, firm tones. He was dressed and undressed like a doll, spoken to in rehearsed formalities, praised for things he had not earned. His world was filled with polished wood, bright banners, warm bread, but also with pressure. The boy saw it in the child's eyes sometimes. The way they darted toward the steward when he stumbled in his recitation. The way he winced when his posture faltered. The way he spoke more quickly when his mother entered the room. And in those moments, something strange happened. The servant boy no longer felt envy. He felt pity. Once, the noble child tripped while walking through the corridor. His knee scraped the stone, and he let out a gasp of pain. The boy rushed forward without thinking, offering a hand. The child slapped it away. I do not need help from you. The boy backed away. Bowed. Said nothing. Later that evening, as he washed the stone floor outside the chamber, the noble child opened the door quietly. He looked down at the boy, then said, barely above a whisper, I did not mean to hit you. The boy nodded. I know. The door closed again. Nothing more was said. In the weeks that followed, they settled into something like routine. The noble child still spoke with command, still gave orders. But his voice softened. He asked fewer cruel questions. One day, he left a piece of honeyed bread on the basin table before his bath. Said nothing. The boy took it when no one was looking. It was the first sweet thing he had tasted in months. Still, the lines were clear. One was master. One was servant. There was no friendship, no closeness, only an occasional flicker of something human beneath the layers of class and silence. And even those flickers were dangerous. Once, while playing outside, the noble child laughed, really laughed, when a bird startled from the bushes and nearly struck his head. The boy laughed too, unable to help himself. It was instinct. The steward, watching from afar, called the servant over later that day. He said, without raising his voice, Do not forget your place. You are here to serve, not to share. That night, the boy did not sleep. He lay awake wondering how many more boundaries could be crossed before the cost was too great. Because in the manor, even a child born noble was not free to choose kindness. And a child born to serve could not afford to be seen as equal, not even for a moment. The noble child was clothed in silk, but bound by iron. And the boy, barefoot and silent, was freer in spirit, but only so long as he remembered to keep that spirit hidden. He woke with the taste of smoke in his throat and ash in his nostrils. Even in dreams, the soot lingered. The fine, dry powder crept into everything, into the threads of his smock, into the lines of his hands, into the corners of his mouth. It was not just residue from fire. It was a symbol. A marker of status. The nobles walked through halls scented with rose and beeswax. He moved through a world of ash. His first task of the day was always the hearth. By the time the manor stirred, the boy had already knelt before cold stones in the Lord's chamber, scooping out last night's remains with a rusted iron shovel. The ash stuck to his skin. It settled in his lungs. One cough too many, and he would be reassigned to something worse. The work was quiet, but never still. The hearth must be emptied, the stones scrubbed, fresh kindling arranged in careful patterns. If it smoked, he was blamed. If it sparked too much, he was blamed. If it failed to catch, he was punished. Perfection was expected in the work of those who were seen the least. When he finished with one hearth, there were more: the kitchen, the chapel, the nursery. Each one black with yesterday's heat. His knees were always stained. His hands always raw. No cloth could truly clean them anymore. And always, after the fires, came the water. Washing was another task assigned without concern for weather or health. Cold water in stone basins. Cold water on bare skin. Cold water poured from buckets that froze his fingertips and numbed his wrists. He did not remember warmth anymore. Only the bite of icy water against a bruised palm. The girl assigned to the laundry was no kinder than the steward. You think the linens care how cold your hands are? She snapped once when he paused too long at the trough. He shook his head. Then scrub. Rinse. Fold. The stone floor by the washing area was always damp. Always slick. He had slipped once, landing hard on his hip. No one came to help. The water had soaked through his smock, and he finished the day shivering, coughing, teeth clenched. They washed everything, not just clothes, but rags, bedsheets, table linens, undergarments. Even the napkins used once by noble guests were handed to servants to clean by hand. No soap was given freely. They used lye, rough and caustic. His hands cracked along the knuckles, bled at the cuticles. He had stopped feeling the sting after a while. pain became a background hum. What no one spoke of was the smell. The stink of days-old cloth, of wet wool, of old food trapped in napkins. The nobles would have fainted at such odors. For the boy, they became normal. He learned to breathe through his mouth, and even that made little difference. Worse still were the chamber pots. Not all nobles used them properly. Some refused to allow them to be emptied until overflowing. Others left them in corners unannounced. When the boy found one, he had to carry it, arms outstretched, nose turned away, across stone corridors and into the waste pit beyond the stables. No gloves. No thanks. Just the sour heat of shame. He did not cry. Crying did nothing. The tears froze in winter and were mocked in summer. After the ashes and the water came the scrubbing. Floors, mostly. Sometimes walls. He knelt with stiff brushes and stale water, removing grime that never truly left. In his second month at the manor, his knees began to bleed. He tore cloth from an old apron and wrapped them tight. Still, the pain came back with every kneel. He once found a beetle crushed into the cracks between two stones. It was the most colorful thing he had seen in days, a flash of green, like a memory of grass. He stared at it longer than he should have. When the steward saw him idle, he was assigned to latrine duty for the rest of the week. There was no soap for the boy himself. After all his work, he had to wash in the same water he used for rags, cold, gray, dirty. His skin never felt clean. His hair clumped. His smell clung to him like shadow. He learned to live in it, to lower his head when others recoiled, to avoid the eyes of noble children who wrinkled their noses when he passed. Ashes in the morning, cold water by noon, scrubbing through dusk. Each day repeated. Each task layered over the last. He began to forget what clean felt like, what it meant to be dry. And yet, beneath it all, he endured. Because endurance was the only thing they could not take. They could take rest, take warmth, take comfort and pride. But they could not stop him from surviving, one filthy, shivering day at a time. The soot may blacken his skin. The water may numb his hands. But inside, beneath the layers of grime and silence, something still stirred. Not rebellion. Not hope. Just a small, stubborn refusal to give in entirely. In the manor, cleanliness was a luxury. But the boy, the servant, had become one with the dirt. And in that filth, he found a kind of strength. Because if they could not scrub him out of the world, then he still mattered. Even if no one ever said his name. In the manor, there was no such thing as an innocent mistake. Every error, no matter how slight, was a threat to the delicate, rigid order of the house. It did not matter how small the act. A slip of the hand, a cracked plate, a pause too long, all were crimes in the eyes of those who ruled. And the sentence was always swift, and never questioned. The boy learned this not through lessons, but through pain. It began on a morning not unlike the others. Gray sky, damp air, cold stone underfoot. He was carrying a tray of goblets to the dining hall, careful with every step, each glass clinking against the others with a dull, anxious rhythm. His hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from fatigue. Days of scrubbing, carrying, kneeling had worn his muscles down to rope. Just outside the archway to the hall, a dog barked. A servant flinched beside him. And in that flinch, the boy's balance shifted. One goblet slid off the tray. It fell in slow motion, as though the air itself held its breath. The sound of it shattering on the stone floor rang louder than the chapel bell. He froze. His heart pounded. His hands went numb. The silence that followed was worse than the sound. Eyes turned. The steward appeared. A nobleman stood from the table, face twisted in disgust. The boy dropped to his knees, began gathering the shards with trembling fingers. Blood appeared at his thumb. "Clumsy," the steward said, voice low and flat. "Leave the pieces. Go to the cellar." The cellar was punishment. Cold, wet, crawling with rats. He spent the day there, scrubbing barrels and dragging crates until his arms went limp. No food. No warmth. When he returned that evening, no one spoke to him. It was as if the breakage had transferred to him, as if he, now, was the thing that had shattered. Another time, he arrived 5 minutes late to the chapel fire. The coals had gone cold. The priest muttered disapproval. The steward assigned him to kneel through the sermon, not on the floor, but on raw grain. The kernels bit into his knees like teeth. He said nothing. He dared not shift. Mistakes were not measured by intention. They were measured by inconvenience. How much they disrupted the order, how many eyes witnessed them. If no one saw it, it could be endured. But if seen, even by one person of rank, the punishment came. The rules were many, but not written. A cloth folded wrong. A name spoken without title. A door left too wide. The boy once called a lady Miss, instead of Mistress. She laughed, but not kindly. Later, he found the soles of his shoes gone. Taken. Not stolen, taken as a lesson. He worked barefoot for a week. Another servant dropped a pitcher during a banquet. It slipped from her wet hands and exploded against the wall. Red wine stained the tapestry. She was dragged out by her hair. The boy never saw her again. Fear became the foundation of every movement. He checked everything twice. Then again. He wiped surfaces that were already clean. He held breath while walking through narrow passages. He whispered the correct responses to himself before speaking. But mistakes came anyway. Fatigue brought them. Hunger brought them. Nerves and noise and chance brought them. And when they came, there was no mercy. No second chances. No soft corrections. Only consequence. Once, a noble boy accused the servant of touching his cloak without permission. It was not true. But truth did not matter. The boy was flogged with a switch, not hard enough to scar, but long enough to bruise. Days later, the noble child laughed and said, "You should have denied it louder." There were no apologies in the manor. Only silence. You were punished, and you returned to work. You were hurt, and you bowed. You failed, and you obeyed harder. The boy began to live inside his own body like a visitor. He detached from sensation, from reaction. When he made a mistake, he no longer flinched. He accepted it. Absorbed it. Folded it into the rhythm of survival. He stopped thinking of fairness. Fairness was a word for the outside world. In the manor, the only justice was the master's mood, the steward's judgment, the luck of whether someone important was watching. And still, despite the pain, he kept going. Because there was no place for softness. No reward for effort. Only punishment for imperfection. In the manor, a mistake was not a lesson. It was a mark. And he carried those marks quietly, like so many others, not on the skin, but deeper. Where no one could see them. Where they would never fade. The bell was not a tool of time in the manor. It was time. Its sound ruled the world of the servants with a certainty sharper than commands, louder than voices, colder than punishment. It marked every moment of the day, every change in task, every rise and fall of hope. The bell was the master they never saw, but always heard. It began before dawn. One long, slow toll that rolled through the corridors like smoke. A groan from the iron above the chapel, a voice that called the servants from sleep with neither warmth nor pause. The boy would wake before it, of course, most of them did, but it was the bell that told him it was real. That sleep had ended. That his body must now rise. Every bell had its meaning. One long ring meant waking. 2 short ones meant chapel. 3 scattered tones meant the steward was summoning all hands. And the sharp, sudden single note, that was for punishment. Everyone knew that one. The bells rang not only in the air, but in the bones. The boy felt them before he heard them. A tightening in the stomach. A twitch in the hands. The ringing did not mark the hour, it controlled the body. The cook rang a smaller bell in the kitchen, one with a high, metallic pitch that grated the ears. It meant the firewood was low, or the broth was to be stirred, or simply that she was angry and someone would pay. The chapel bell was different. Deeper. Slower. It called them to kneel, not to act. To fold their hands and recite words half remembered, whispered into the frost. The boy had no prayers left. He mouthed the words, but his mind stayed elsewhere, on unfinished work, on empty belly, on the ache in his knees. In a place where nothing was said directly, the bells became a language. Their rhythm, their tone, their weight. A ringing just before dusk meant the master was returning from the hunt. A gentle chime at mid-morning signaled guests arriving. And when the bells fell silent for too long, it meant someone had made a mistake, and something was being decided. The bells taught him urgency. He moved faster when they rang. He did not think. He acted. Once, he spilled a basin because the bells startled him mid-step. Another time, he dropped a cloth because he miscounted the chimes and arrived early. But worse than error was lateness. To ignore the bell, even for a breath, was to suggest disobedience. The steward once slapped a boy across the face for pausing to finish a chore after the bell had rung. "The bell decides," he said, not looking back. The boy learned to respond without thought. To move the moment the bell began to ring. To shift from sweeping to scrubbing, from folding to running, from silence to chanting, all in sync with iron and air. The bell replaced instinct. It replaced memory. He could not have said what hour it was, or even the day. But he knew the meaning of each sound, the order of each tone. His life was not lived in hours, but in intervals, between the first bell and the next. Between one command and the silence that followed. Some bells echoed in dreams. A high, reedy tone that played while he slept, waking him in the dark to nothing. His ears still rang long after the sound had stopped. Sometimes he would flinch at a wind chime in the distance, thinking it a call. The noble guests admired the bells. They said the manor's timekeeping was elegant. That the bells lent the house a sense of dignity and order. They smiled at their sound. But they never had to follow them. For the servants, the bells were chains. Beautiful, invisible chains that stretched from tower to chamber, from chapel to kitchen. The boy could not see them, but he felt their weight with every step. There was no freedom between the bells. Only preparation for the next. Even the moments of rest were measured. A short ring for meals. A long tone for evening. A series of fading chimes to signal lights out. He often lay awake after that final bell, eyes wide in the dark, waiting for the next day to begin. And when it did, it began not with sunlight, not with voices, not with thought, but with the low groan of iron from above. The bell did not just rule his body. It had taken his sense of time, his sense of self, and wrung it out like water from a cloth. In the manor, when the bells rang, you obeyed. And when they did not, you feared what might come instead. The great hall was the jewel of the manor, vaulted ceilings, carved beams, and windows taller than any servant dared to dream. Sunlight pierced the stained glass like blessings only nobles could receive. Tapestries lined the walls, thick with stories of battles won, beasts slain, and saints crowned. The boy had cleaned them once, climbing a wooden ladder with shaking knees, holding on to the needlework with rag-wrapped fingers. He was not allowed to look too closely at the scenes. The steward said it was not his history to read. The boy's history lived lower, near the floor. He worked mostly in the margins of the great hall, cleaning corners, setting firewood, polishing the silver. Never in the center. Never on the carpet where the nobles dined. That space was sacred. Their voices carried like songs, full of confidence and comfort. Their laughter rose like wind. And the boy moved quietly in the edges, careful not to let his shadow stretch too far. Servants were not meant to be seen in the hall. Only the work they left behind. A gleaming plate. A candle trimmed to just the right length. A goblet filled before it was empty. The boy learned to move like a breath, present, but imperceptible. He knew how to pause in doorways, how to turn away from the light, how to lower his head so the flicker of a noble's glance passed over him without catching. He watched the hall transform with each event. Banquets turned it to gold. Musicians lined the walls. Nobles wore gowns that sparkled like frost. The boy saw a lady once in a dress so wide she needed help to walk. Her smile was effortless. Her laughter made no sound in his ears, only in his memory. At night, the hall changed. When the candles dimmed and the nobles had gone to bed, the servants came to clean. The boy would walk across the carpet then, barefoot, careful. The scent of wine and roast still clung to the air. Crumbs scattered like sand. He would kneel by the long table and wipe away the evidence of joy. There was a mirror above the fireplace. He caught glimpses of himself there sometimes. Just a flicker, a hunched back, a bent neck, a pair of hands always moving. The nobles stood before that mirror to adjust their collars. The boy avoided it, ashamed of his reflection. One afternoon, he was told to stand by the wall while the Lord addressed his guests. For an hour, He held a silver tray with a jug of wine. No one took it. They ignored him completely. But he felt the sweat drip down his spine. His arms burned. His knees trembled. Still he stood. Still he obeyed. And when the steward finally dismissed him, no one looked his way. It was strange, he thought, to be so present and yet so absent. He existed in the hall like a ghost, real enough to serve, invisible enough to forget. A shadow among shadows. Sometimes he imagined what it would be like to walk through the center of the hall with his head high. To sit at the table. To lift a goblet and drink without permission. But even in imagination, the vision failed. The walls seemed to lean inward. The tapestries glared. The candles dimmed. He knew his place. One day, he dropped a cloth during a midday feast. It landed with barely a sound. But the steward saw. A noble laughed. The boy was pulled aside, scolded, made to stand outside in the rain for an hour. When he returned, dripping, he walked carefully around the outer edge of the hall. He did not look up. That evening, the other servants sat in the storeroom and whispered stories. One girl said the great hall was haunted. Another boy said he had seen a servant vanish there once, swallowed by the wall itself. The boy said nothing. He knew the only ghosts in the hall were the ones who still lived. Because the hall did not remember names. It did not remember hands that had cleaned it, feet that had tread softly across its floor. It only remembered the sparkle of silver, the scent of spice, the echoes of noble laughter. The boy understood this. He did not belong in the hall. He belonged to it. He was not a guest. Not a witness. He was the part no one saw. The hall was grand, yes. But for the servants, it was a stage with no lines, no costumes, and no applause. Only silence. Only shadows. Winter came to the manor not like a sudden storm, but like a slow, creeping hand, seeping through the cracks in the stone, tightening around the ribs, settling in the joints like an unspoken sentence. There was no moment when autumn ended and winter began. It was simply a gradual thinning of warmth, a steady retreat of comfort, until there was nothing left but cold. For the servants, winter meant more than frost. It meant suffering. The boy felt it first in his fingers. They would stiffen in the early hours, curled around the bucket handle, trembling as he tried to lift the water from the frozen well. The bucket would stick to the edge. Ice crusted the rope. The wind bit at the skin between his sleeves and the edge of his smock. He wore the same clothes year-round. There were no coats for servants. Only layers, thin, tattered, handed down. He slept under a woolen sheet too short to cover both feet and chest. He had learned to curl tightly, knees to chin, arms wrapped around his legs like twine. Even then, the cold found him. It crawled across the floor, up through the straw, into his bones. Mornings were worst. The dormitory air was so cold that frost formed on the inside of the windows. Breath came in plumes. The stone floor was painful to touch, let alone walk on barefoot. The boy tried wrapping cloth around his feet, but it wore through in days. One morning, he stepped on a patch of ice and slipped. His shoulder ached for weeks afterward. The cold did not just slow him. It hollowed him out. Made him clumsy. His hands dropped things more easily. His joints resisted. Tasks that once took minutes stretched into hours. But there was no forgiveness for slowness. The steward did not believe in excuses. "The cold does not excuse failure," he said once, after a boy broke a plate with numbed fingers. "It proves weakness." So the boy learned to hide the shaking in his limbs. He bit his tongue when it cracked from dryness. He worked through coughs. He ignored the blood when it stained his knuckles. He was not alone. All of them did it, boys, girls, old women. No one showed pain. They showed obedience. That was safer. Even the chores turned cruel in winter. Drawing water meant cracking ice. Washing cloth meant soaking frozen hands. Firewood grew scarce. Ash built faster. The hearths needed more tending, but the supply was thinner. They rationed warmth like food. A single log for the laundry. 2 for the kitchen. None for the dormitory. He dreamed of warmth, not comfort, just enough to feel his fingers again. He once placed his hands too close to the hearth while cleaning, and the skin blistered. But even that pain felt like relief. At least it meant he could feel something. Illness spread quickly. A cough became a rattle. A sore throat turned to fever. Servants disappeared from their beds and were never seen again. No questions were asked. The boy did not know where they went. He only knew that he must not follow. Once he saw a girl faint in the corridor. Her lips were blue. She had been cleaning the chapel since dawn. No one stopped to help. The steward stepped over her, then called for someone to mop the floor. Food grew scarcer in winter. Bread was thinner. Broth was more water than flavor. Meat was a memory. Hunger joined the cold, and together they became a single torment, a slow gnawing at the body's edges. The boy's face thinned. His cheeks sank. His ribs pressed harder against the smock. Still he worked. Still he obeyed. One night, the wind howled so loudly it seemed to shake the manor itself. The boy lay awake in the dark, limbs trembling, lips cracked. He imagined the snow piling outside the walls, sealing them in forever. He imagined the cold becoming permanent, turning him to stone where he lay. And yet, when the bell rang the next morning, he rose. Because that was what was required. There was no warmth waiting for him. No fire. No kindness. Only more water to carry. More stone to scrub. More commands to obey. Winter in the manor was not just a season. It was a trial. A test of the body's limits. A stripping of comfort, of softness, of everything that made one feel human. But in surviving it, he found something deeper. Not strength, exactly. Not pride. Only this: he was still alive. And in a place that offered nothing freely, even that was something. Even that was a kind of victory. He first heard the word escape whispered in the laundry hall, in a voice so low it barely carried above the slosh of icy water and the scrape of wood against stone. It came from a boy older than him, with eyes like ash and a scar down his forearm. "My cousin," the boy said, staring straight ahead. "He ran. He made it to the woods. They say he got out." No one responded. Not out loud. But every ear heard it. Every pair of eyes flicked briefly toward the door. Escape. It was not a word servants used often, because it carried weight. Danger. Temptation. Hope. It was a word so heavy that just thinking it too loudly could draw the steward's gaze. But once planted in the mind, it refused to leave. The boy thought about it in the quiet hours, while scrubbing the base of the stone walls, while hauling buckets of soot through frozen courtyards. He would look at the trees beyond the manor wall, bare in winter, gold in autumn, and wonder what lay beyond them. The idea came slowly. Not as a plan, but as a question: what if? What if he slipped away during the feast? What if he hid in the stables and waited for nightfall? What if he ran, barefoot, through the mud and snow and did not stop? Others had tried. That much he knew. One girl vanished in the early spring. She had been kind, one of the few who shared her bread when she could. One day she was gone. The steward said she was reassigned. But the whispers told a different story. She had tried to flee. They caught her at the edge of the forest. She was brought back. Not whole. Not the same. After that, no one asked where she was. Still, the dream persisted. Because the manor was not just a place of stone and work. It was a cage. A beautiful, brutal cage. And even the most obedient bird sometimes looked at the sky. The boy imagined freedom as a forest path, soft beneath his feet. As a stream with clean water. As a cottage with smoke curling from the roof, and someone waiting inside. He did not know who. Just someone who spoke his name, not his duties. But then he would wake, if he had slept at all, and find himself back beneath the cracked beams of the dormitory, the straw scratching his skin, the cold in his lungs. The dream would fade, but never fully leave. One evening, he stood near the outer gate, sent to deliver rags to the stable hands. The sun had just begun to sink, casting long shadows across the yard. For a moment, no one watched him. The gate was half open. Beyond it, the road curled down toward the woods. He could have run. He stood frozen, heart hammering, rags clenched in his fist. Just beyond, freedom beckoned. Or punishment. Or both. A voice called behind him, the cook's assistant. "Boy! Move!" He turned. Walked back. Said nothing. That night, he hated himself. Not for staying, but for hesitating. The dream of escape was not just about fleeing. It was about believing there could be something else. Something more. And that belief was dangerous. It made obedience harder. It made silence heavier. Some servants clung to that dream until it rotted inside them. Others let it go early, like a dead limb. The boy held it quietly. Not in his mouth. Not even in his heart. But somewhere deeper, in the marrow, where even the cold could not reach. He saw others whose dreams had died. Their eyes held no reflection. Their backs hunched even when they stood straight. They moved like ghosts who had forgotten what they once were. He did not want to become that. So he kept the dream. Just a piece of it. Just enough. He knew the risks. He knew the stories. He knew that most who ran were caught. That those who made it out often starved, or froze, or were brought back and made examples. But even so, he thought, better to run and fail than never to try. Better to chase the wind than to become part of the stone. And maybe one day, not today, not soon, but one day, he would hear the bell, and he would not answer it. He would see the gate, and he would not walk past it. He would walk through. Because the manor might own his labor. It might break his body. But it did not yet own his dream. And while that lived, quietly, deeply, he was still more than a servant. He was a boy who could imagine a different life. And sometimes, in a place built to crush such things, that imagination was the greatest act of rebellion. There was no chapel for the servants. Not really. There was a small wooden bench near the back wall, behind the pews reserved for the steward and the noble family. It creaked under weight and was never dusted. No candle burned there unless one of the older maids lit it in secret. Still, the boy sat there when he could, not to rest, but to whisper the only prayer he knew. It had no words. It was not the Latin verses the priest chanted. Not the elegant phrases the noblewoman repeated with folded hands. His prayer had no structure. It was a thought, a breath, a pleading that rose up not from the tongue but from the bones. Sometimes it sounded like, "Let me endure." Sometimes like, "Let me be forgotten." Sometimes just, "Let me not be hurt today." In the silence of the chapel, his breath became the prayer. Slow. Shallow. Steady. He bowed his head, not out of reverence but out of habit. There was no saint who would intervene. No angel who would descend. Only the silence. Only the stones. Only the smell of wax and old wood. The others prayed too, in their own ways. The girl in the kitchen crossed herself every time she opened the oven. The older man in the stables whispered names before sleep. One boy carved tiny crosses into the wood of his bed frame with a stolen spoon. These were not prayers for salvation. They were prayers for survival. The boy once asked the steward quietly if servants were allowed to attend full mass. "You are allowed to hear it," the steward replied, "but not to interrupt it." So he listened. Week after week, he stood in the back, hands clasped, heart quiet. He did not understand most of what was said. But he understood the rhythm. Rise, kneel, listen, obey. It was the same pattern that ruled the manor. He remembered how his mother had prayed. She would light a tiny clay lamp and press her hand over her heart. Her prayers had been for crops, for health, for peace. Hers were the prayers of a woman who believed in change. His were different. He prayed not for change, but for endurance. He never prayed to be seen, only to remain unnoticed. That was safety. That was how he lasted this long. But on nights when the frost crept beneath the doors, when the ache in his legs refused to fade, when the silence felt too heavy, he dared to ask more. Let me not become empty. Because that was the truest danger in the manor. Not hunger, not cold, not pain, but the loss of self. The slow fading of memory, of identity, of voice. He had seen it happen to others. Their eyes dimmed. Their backs bent. Their voices became whispers. And so, in his prayer, he asked not to be spared. Just to be whole. Just to remain someone, even if only inside. Once, he found a scrap of parchment near the chapel. Blank. Torn. He hid it in the hem of his smock. At night, when the others slept, he would press it between his palms and close his eyes. Pretend it was a letter. Pretend it had his name on it. Pretend someone, somewhere, still remembered him. That was his prayer too. The manor never gave thanks. Not to its servants. Not even to its stones. It demanded, consumed, endured. But the boy gave thanks quietly, for each day survived, for each lash avoided, for each moment of stillness where no one called his name. In the end, he had nothing. No coin. No title. No bed of his own. But he had a prayer. And that prayer was enough. Because the boy who served without rest, without recognition, without reward, he still had a voice inside. And even if no one heard it, it echoed. It was the sound of a child who had not surrendered fully. It was the whisper of dignity, buried but alive. It was a prayer. Not for heaven, but for himself. So now, as the last candle gutters out and the manor sinks into silence once more, let the stillness settle around you. The servants have folded into straw beds, worn hands tucked close, eyes closed not in fear, but in quiet surrender. You have walked their halls. You have felt the cold stone, heard the creak of wood beneath bare feet, smelled the soot, and seen the low flicker of firelight. You have worked beside them, waited beside them, endured beside them. And now, it is time to rest as they did, silently, softly, completely. If this journey helped you feel a little more grounded, a little less alone, I invite you to like the video and subscribe. It helps me keep these gentle, human histories alive. Let me know in the comments where you are watching from, and what time it is for you. I love seeing the quiet corners of the world gather here, one kind, tired heart at a time. Now dim the lights, draw the blankets close. And let the hush of the manor guide you the rest of the way. Sleep well. You are safe here. You are home.